last we were talking about, really it's like we have different ways of holding frames on reality. And just want to spend a little time talking about the ways that we use those, and for you to kind of identify, what are the ways that you use these different frames. So for example, it's like if I'm going to fix the faucet or something like that, and I'm taking the pieces apart and going down to the hardware store and finding, oh, I need one of these, and coming back and putting it together. The idea that the world is made of objects and particles is really useful. It's just kind of like common sense. It's like, well, yeah, that works. It's very effective. It's efficient. It's our whole technological system is based on that kind of a model. We build in that model. So okay, create the pieces, make them all the same, the whole mass production thing, put them together, whatever. And if I'm watching the news, I'm watching how people. I'm always trying to read through the spin. It's like there's the story, and then there's the way that there's what happened, and then there's the filters that are being put on it. And then if the subject is people sharing their personal practice or their spiritual experience or their beliefs or things like that, then it's it's like, let's say I'm reading somebody who's sort of studied with Yogananda or something like that, and I'm hearing what they're saying. It's like, wow, there's a lot of resonances there. Wow, that really makes sense. Wow, I can relate to that. Like, wow, they must be doing, basically the same thing that I'm doing, or something like that. So those are just kind of examples. So I just wanted to. It's one thing to listen to all this stuff and have it theoretical, but it's like when you apply it and go, oh yeah, this is where I use those things. I just want to invite you to, think about and share where are the places that you use these different lenses. How do you apply them? What kind of situations do you use?
I immediately come up with interactions that I have with people, just perception of or interpretation of things said or done.
So where would you put that? Like on the reality made of stories?
Mm-hmm.
You probably get some of that with your students.
Mm-hmm.
Where they're like trying to find some kind of, well, maybe she'll buy this.
Mm-hmm.
But what I also hear about in terms of story from you, from our discussion, is that by you examining their life story, the narrative, their backstory, who they are outside of the structure of the school you work in, that informs you who they are and what they bring with them, and then gives you the opportunity to really show up with them
Mm-hmm.
in a much more profound way.
Mm-hmm.
Because people's narratives and stories are important pieces of who they are and what they bring, and I hear that you recognize that.
Yeah. I mean, probably why I don't listen to the news half the time. The news really, to me, is more of a comedy show than it is anything else. But I have a tendency to be really analytical about things in life, like all crossover relationships, whether it's work, whether it's personal, whether it's whatnot. If something comes to me, I always find myself analyzing or looking into more than just what's right there in front of me, because I just feel like that's just a piece of it. I always feel like there's a much bigger picture. That could be a blessing and a curse, I think.
Yeah.
So you look for context.
Yeah.
Which is kind of in that second category of story.
Yeah.
It's kind of the interconnectedness of the relationship.
Now you do alternative work as well as medical you're an RN, but you also do
medical massage. So I had
Okay.
my own. I still have it. I'm trying to wean it off. It's a slow process. For over 11 and a half years now.
Right. But the reason I bring it up is because what I understand, being very involved in the alternative healing world, is that, in seeing how you're working professionally, you're actually holding two pieces. You're holding a much more holistic view from a massage point of view. And yet, from an RN point of view, where you're tucked into the medical model, which is completely based on particles. It's based on, number one, world is made of objects and particles. And there's real value to Western medicine, especially in crisis intervention. I mean, nothing works better than Western medical model when you have something, when you really need intervention fast, right? But what we also know as holistic healers is that the medical model has real limitations. That lens on reality has limitations when it comes to well-beingness. So then we shift into another lens, right? And that lens is that the world is interconnected, is an alive system of interconnected beings.
Well, that one's not up here yet.
But that's not up there yet. Okay. But you know what I'm saying? We hold very, very different realities and different lenses.
But there is an aspect of the holistic that is the sort of the honoring of the narrative.
Right.
It's like you've got the particle. Okay, let's take you in, and like you said, that's great. I mean, if my heart stopped and I'm going, let's see, epi or shaman, epi or shaman. Probably gonna go with the Western medicine on that. But the piece that has been brought into medical practice is like, okay, you actually have to stop and you have to listen to people, or at least you have to pretend that you're listening to them, and that the engagement with their story, with their narrative, is actually part of the healing process.
And finding the resonances between the two of you. So it's relational.
Mm-hmm.
It's that reality is made up of stories. Part of that is that it's a relational state rather than the first, which doesn't depend on real relationship.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sure that you don't have to go too far to relate to the world made us objects and particles thing. I mean, you get that with medical practice, and I'm sure you never get that with psychology or
No.
fixing up your house or anything like
We
that.
never get that as long as it fits into the new DSM.
There you go.
I see DSM 5.
Yeah.
But there's a way that the DSM-5 is kind of like the playbook for the appropriate stories.
True. There's real value in it,
Uh-huh.
as long as it's not the only story that you're listening to, or that it gives people a language to communicate about what might be going on.
Right, and it puts parameters on that language.
Yeah.
So it's really working in the structure of narrative to block out. It's really, in some ways, it's trying to make objects out of narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Uh-huh.
Make something that seems intangible a little bit more tangible
Yes.
somehow.
A little more particle-y,
Right.
Oh yeah.
Controllable.
because particle equals real.
Well, then we know what medication to give.
Right.
Sure.
And sometimes actually that is
Yeah.
appropriate.
Absolutely.
Uh,
It all has,
yeah.
and that's the point, it all has its value.
Yeah.
So could you speak to your process around a little bit about how you use the lens of the DSM 4 or 5 or whatever, and then where you go, how it spreads out? The way Audrey is both RN and holistic healer, and there's some sort of bridge where she's able to bring both lenses. Is there a way that you could speak how those lenses work for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's even more complex because 95% of my business is insurance, and that's a whole different lens.
Right.
You know, then that gets into documenting, like for Medicare or something, or which is even a more restricted story, or it's a more restricted particle. We'll pay for this, but not that. But the DSM-5 is a good framework because there are groups. There's commonalities in depression. There's commonalities in anxiety. Having done this for almost 30 years, I jokingly say with some of the other therapists, okay, gee, I wonder if I'm going to hear a new story today. Which is kind of, there's not really a new story, but on the other hand, everybody that comes in has their own story.
Yeah.
No two people with depression have the same narrative, especially when I'm listening from different levels, listening from here and here, then all of a sudden it's this infinite variety of
Wow.
story, of experience. So then it's working, it is kind of this duality, not duality, but it's listening, but working within this framework of, okay, you know, I need to kind of pay attention to the fact that this is, we'll just label it depression, but then what else is going on? You know, under that, around that, in that, other than that.
That's so interesting. There's so many pieces of what you just said that I would love to explore. I mean, may not be the time, but the idea that, you know, that everyone has this, that the story is the same on, you know, on one level, and on another level, everyone has a different narrative, but there's sort of the collectivity of story, and then the individualism of story, and all of that's very, very interesting stuff. And the different points of references you have to use and locations you have to use to bring all of yourself to your sessions and your clients. Yeah.
I bet the movie producers say the same thing. I wonder if I got to read a new story today.
Yeah, and they're saying no, but maybe we'll get a little different spin.
Right. Something fresh.
Yeah.
Right.
So what about that sort of frame that, you know, all religions are the same?
The same?
Yeah, you know, or basically the same.
Or bring
Headed-
people to the same place.
Yeah, headed in the same direction.
You know.
I think I would, okay, now, are we talking about the purity of whatever? Yeah, that's
We're
not
talking
right.
about, we're just kind of the general
General.
subject, and do you have experience of sitting anywhere near that with your own variation of it? Or
My
meeting with somebody with
yeah.
a different tradition and going, oh wow, that is really, you know.
I think the heart of religion, or the core of the stories, leads to basically the same idea, but in many different. And that's not the dogma of the religion or how people distort it, but
Sure.
the core of it, yeah, to me it gets to the same place.
Yeah.
That kind of,
I'm kind of the same, you know, same view. I think that there's a core underlying goal that everyone is seeking, and I think the pathways are just very different. I think that the political structures around them are very, very different, and don't always feed the goal.
what would you say is that goal?
You know, I'm not sure I'm 100% clear on that. I think that there's an underlying understanding of humanity to be loving, and a need for nurturing and community and peace. And I think that, and it to seek some sort of higher understanding, right?
That's a great answer in terms of, you know, I mean, I think that's a perfect answer because it's like, it's such a common experience to feel like there is some commonality, and then when we try to get to the specifics, it's really hard to say. It's like it's like, well, what is that? And that's what the challenge is. It's like, well, yeah, my sense is, but if I have to put words on it, that's really hard. So, so you see how we actually all use these different models, and there's a way, I think, that we actually use them at the same time. And the science view of the body being made of particles, like you said, you know, it's great, it's very effective. We use it all the time. And at the same time, when we're talking about the mind and relationship with people, we can assume that there's really a reality that's based on the stories and the narratives that we tell. And then there's this sense that spirit is some kind of a divine dimension that's hidden from us. We can't really articulate it, but we just have a sense that there's something real there. And depending on the situation, we're jumping from one of them to the other. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, we actually don't have a single frame. We don't actually operate in a single frame. We're actually shifting views of reality depending on what we're doing. Now, of course, the scientific project is trying to say, how can we do all of these things from a consistent point of view? So if you take body made of particles, you get, you know, the particle view and you apply it to bodies, you get medicine. If you take the particle view and you apply it to the mind, you get the kind of psychology that we have, and that is increasingly trying to get more in that direction. If you take the particle view and you apply it to spirit, you get materialism or atheism or something like that. Essentially, because it's saying that whole spirit thing, well, it doesn't really, there is no such thing.
Well, there is, right? But we just haven't figured out what kind of particles it's made up.
Exactly,
Yet.
the God particle.
Yeah.
Or sort of an adherence to quantum physics,
Uh-huh.
right?
Right.
Yeah, something like
We're
that.
just not smart enough yet to figure out.
Right.
Quantum is mysterious and God is mysterious, therefore quantum explains God.
Well, you
I
know,
like
there are a
that.
lot of New Agey people who can connect very, you know, clearly New Age precepts with quantum theorems.
Sure. And it does give a language that sounds scientific to try to talk about things that science can't really touch. So it serves in that way, even if when you really put it on to the test, it doesn't entirely hold up.
Quantum physics, though, is challenging the straight-ahead particle theory in a way, too, right? Because in
Right.
quantum physics, there's something else. The observer affects the
That's right.
experiment.
Right.
Right. There's the relational aspect
Yeah.
where you can't. So it challenges the strictly particle paradigm.
Mhm.
But from there to making direct applications of what's happening in very, very small particles and saying that explains this aspect of consciousness,
Mhm.
that's a little bit more of a leap that you'd have to have a whole lot of fill-in information in between to make that balance. But you're right, it challenges the model. It challenges the idea that everything is just separate particles. Billiard balls,
Yeah.
but smaller. So, one of the points I want to make is that philosophy is everywhere. We're always using it. It's whenever we're talking, we're assuming some philosophy. Philosophy is not some add-on. It isn't like, oh, we have our everyday lives and then you do philosophy on top of it. Philosophy is in every interaction that we do. And so, for example, if you go to first grade and you get your reader and it has these pictures with names on it, what's the philosophy lesson? they're teaching reading, but they're also teaching philosophy. And what's the philosophy lesson?
There's objects that we can name, and they're specific and separate.
The world is made of objects.
Yeah.
This is a lesson in how to divide the world into objects. Because little kids don't do that. You know, I mean, it's like they're much more, they're immersed in life. Life is all connected. And all of a sudden they come, it's like, oh, here's a white page with separate objects on it and separate words on it. And it's training in particle thinking. So we have an induction in a philosophical system under the guise of teaching reading. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Another place that we had philosophy is in creation stories. So, the Big Bang is essentially a creation story based on the particle model. Creation stories are stories about how the world really is. If you go to the humanities, it's really about the world being created through narrative. And if you go to religion, it's the world consisting of living presence. And of course, that third one is the one that's consistent with transformation. Because the scientific model doesn't have room for transformation, because all you have is particles. They can change the way they're organized, but it's not really transformation. It's just like differently ordered. Narrative, there are transformative stories, but they're not really connected to the particles. They just kind of ride on top of. It's kind of like that thing where the body is made of particles, the mind is made of stories. So you can have this transformation, but you're just making it up in your mind. So religion is the realm that really can talk about transformation. But the problem there is, actually what I want to show you is that even religious stories in the West have been shifted to be more consistent with a scientific worldview. So, probably the most well-known creation story in the West is Genesis. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Then there's this phrase about, and the earth was without form and void. And it's like, it's easy to look at that and go, oh yeah, well that's just kind of like the Big Bang. It's like, yeah, there's nothing really going on there. And what I want to do is compare this with a Babylonian story that is somewhat earlier than the Genesis story, but has a lot of resonances with it, and really show how that interpretation, just as an example, that particular interpretation is not in line with the kind of literature and thinking that the Genesis story came out of. So in the Babylonian story, somebody read that?
When up above the sky had not been named, down below the land had not been called by name. Apsu, primeval,
Primeval.
their begetter.
Mumu, yes.
Mumu, and Tiamat, she who gave birth to them all, mingled their waters together. And no pasture land had been formed, not even a reed marsh was to be seen. When the gods had not been brought into being, they had not been called by name, their destinies had not yet been fixed. At the time were the gods created within them.
Okay. This is from the Enuma Elish. It's a Babylonian creation story. Now, if we look at that a little more closely, what we have is three elements. You have Tiamat, who is the mother, who gave birth to them all. And Tiamat is the salt water. Apsu is the father, and Apsu is the fresh water. And Mumu is the fog that hovers over the fresh water, is the advisor to and servant of this father presence. And notice the father has an assistant, the mother does not. These stories come really out of Sumer. These are Sumerian deities, and Sumer is in what is now Iraq, and down in the southern expanses of Iraq you have the largest wetlands in the world, huge wetlands, and during the fall and winter these are saltwater marshes, and then when the snow melts and the water flows down the rivers, they become freshwater marshes. So you have this mingling of the salt water and the fresh water. So the creation story talks about the salt water and the fresh water not being separated, being mingled together, and this fog hovering over them. So that's the image of the primeval condition, if you will. Now these two deities, Tiamat and Apsu, have offspring. They have Lahmu and Lahamu, who have grandchildren, Anshar and Ki, and then a bunch of great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. And she has this big, noisy family, including a couple of characters, one called Ea and one called Marduk. They're down in the great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. And this bunch, according to the story, gets so noisy. Tiamat, all she wants to do is rest. But she can't sleep because of the racket that these grandchildren, great-grandchildren are making. And so Apsu doesn't know what to do. His wife can't get any rest. So Mumu whispers in his ear and says, "You know, I hate to tell you, but the grandkid's gotta go. You're gonna have to kill him." And the grandkids get wind of this. And so Ea paralyzes Apsu and stops the plot. Well, Tiamat grieves for years, and she goes, and eventually she goes into such a rage that she turns herself into a dragon. Actually, the term is the basis for the word Leviathan. She turns herself into a dragon and she pursues Ea. And Ea first stands up and fights, but then he flees in terror. Now, it's not looking so good for the grandkids right now. But one of the younger generation, Marduk, turns and is able to capture Tiamat in a great net. And he shoots an arrow into her mouth that pierces her heart and kills her. Then he takes Tiamat and he cuts her in two, and half of her becomes the waters of the sea, and half of her becomes the waters above the earth, so like the clouds and so on and so forth. And then he takes Apsu, the fresh water, and he puts a covering on Apsu, and that becomes the land. And that's the reason that if you dig down through the earth, you'll come to fresh water. So that's the story. Now, all right, so you have Tiamat turning into the water below and the water above, and you have Apsu with the covering becoming the land, right? And then if you kind of graph this out, you've got Tiamat as the salt water, you've got Apsu as the fresh water, you've got Mumu as the fog that's over the fresh water. No, notice, not with the salt water. You've got Marduk, who divides Tiamat into the water below and the water above, and turns Apsu into the land. Right? So that's the basic structure of the story. If you go to the Genesis story, the world was without form and void is the way it's pronounced. But the terms in Hebrew are tohu and bohu. The world was tohu v'bohu. Now those are not Hebrew words. But in terms of a proper name, if you go to the Sumerian names, you have a lot of names that end in U. You have Apsu, Enkidu, Lahmu, Lahamu. It's a very common ending of a proper name. So these are probably Sumerian names. Now if you look at the similarities in the story, you have Adonai who is taking the water and dividing it. The Genesis story doesn't say that Adonai created the water, which is an interesting point, but that the water was divided. He divided the water into the water below and the water above, and that he called all the water into one place so that the land could appear. It doesn't say the land was created, it just says the land could appear. And you have darkness over the face. In the next couple of stanzas, you have darkness over the face of the deep. Now, tohu is very similar to the word tehom, which is the word for deep, for the sea. You have darkness over the sea, but you have the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. So you have a very similar kind of setup where you have this Spirit hovering over the waters, and you have the deep. And you have the waters being divided into the waters above and the waters below, and the land being called forth. But instead of Marduk, it's Adonai. So the basic elements of the story are all there. If you turn and go back to the Genesis narrative, I'm going to have to put on my glasses for this. So in the beginning, God, or Marduk, created the heaven and the earth was Tohu, or Tiamat, and Bohu, Apsu, and the darkness was upon the face of the Tehom, which is the sea, or Tiamat, and the Spirit of God, or Mumu, hovered over the face of the waters, Apsu. And God, or Marduk, made the firmament and divided the waters, Tiamat, which were above the firmament, from the waters, Tiamat, that were below the firmament. And God, or Marduk, said, "Let the dry land appear." Now, whatever you want to there are probably somebody could give a long exposition of how the differences are just as important as the similarities. But what I want to show is that in a very similar story, this is not of the world being created out of dark nothingness. This is the world being created out of divine presences. Everything in the world is alive. When you go back to the roots of religious traditions, to the shamanic roots of religious traditions, everything is alive. The world is a community of presences. It is not, sort of just like without form and empty. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if you go back to the Genesis and say, then the earth was without form and void, you can go, wait a minute, that's a modernist lens being put on that. That's a lens that takes out, that overlooks the fact that this is a world in which everything is living. There is no just sort of empty darkness out of which a big bang can come. What there is a world teeming with life. Every aspect of the world is alive. Every aspect of the world is something that we can have a relationship with. Right?
What comes up for me is that it's relatively recent that the concept of zero actually arose.
Mm-hmm.
It was, when was it, like somewhere between 7th and 12th century, zero, the concept of zero
right.
came into being.
Somewhere
that
between
it was never in human consciousness that that nothingness existed. There was always somethingness.
Right. I mean, even Roman numerals don't have a zero in them.
Right,
It was the Arabic system that developed the zero.
exactly, right.
So, so you got the sciences, you got the humanities, and you got religion. And so the religion domain is kind of the area where transformation can be real. Because if the world is made of living presence, then things can change. Right? Because living beings have the capacity of transformation. It's a whole different paradigm. But here's the problem. Which one? We have all, especially since in the last couple hundred years, used to be people would live their whole lives and, they were within their own community and really only exposed to one tradition. And now we have all this interconnectedness, and we can go down to the city and meet Buddhists and Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims and what have you. I mean, it's the diversity is something we encounter all the time. So how do we deal with the variety of religions and models and so on and so forth without either making all of them wrong, which is applying the scientific lens, making them all right but not real, which is the humanities lens, or making just one of them right, which is the religious lens? See the problem? So here we go, we've got, okay, we believe in that transformation is possible. We know it's possible. We've experienced it. We've seen it. We've listened to the stories about it. It's like a tremendously valuable thing. I mean, what is there that is more appealing than transformation? How to really change the situation, how to really change your life, how to really change some issue that you've been struggling with for years. Very, very appealing. Okay? And at the same time, in order to hold some kind of intelligent framework on it, science isn't going to do it. Humanities by themselves aren't going to do it. You have to go into this realm of religion where you have all these different traditions that all have their own models and their own views and their own vocabulary. How do we make sense of it? How do we find something? How can we tease out, oh, this is what transformation is about, rather than, well, I'll tell you what, you come down to Tibet House and we'll teach you Tibetan language and we'll teach you the prayers, and someday you'll understand what this is all about. Maybe 20, 30 years from now, you'll have a good framework on it, so that you actually have to enter into some community of, but then of course, even after you do that, you only understand it from one point of view. And if transformation is a real thing in the world, if it's a real thing in human experience, then it has to be somehow something that goes across traditions. So, perennial philosophy was sort of a first attempt at trying to solve that problem. Trying to solve the problem of what is it that is in common in different spiritual traditions. How do we extract the transformative piece? How do we get what the real human capacity is? And what perennial philosophy suggests is that there is a hidden dimension, an ultimate divine, and out of that come all of these various traditions that are culturally different. But somehow there's something about them that's the same. So, where did this idea come from? This idea that there could be commonalities, that there could be some golden thread that connects traditions over cultural diversity and over time. Probably rooted in Christian theology. Augustine of Hippo, it's interesting, He's considered a Christian theologian, but he actually lived, he was born and lived in Africa, so he was actually an African theologian, though I've actually never heard that said. Jeff, I don't know, could you read that quote there?
Yeah, the very thing that is now called the Christian religion was not wanting among the ancients from the beginning of the human race, until Christ came in the flesh, after which the true religion, which had already existed, began to be called Christian.
So there you have the earliest reference that I've seen to this idea that, well, this is a truth that's always been the same, and that's what perennial philosophy is about. Perennial, like perennial flowers, they come back every year, right? And they're always the same. So perennial philosophy is this idea that there is an enduring truth that never changes, that has always been the same, that has always been present in various ways in different traditions, but it's always the same truth. It's what reflects that hidden divine ultimate that you can't see in the world, but you can glimpse it through these little pieces in various traditions. That's perennialism. Interestingly enough, did any of you see the movie, the Abraham Lincoln movie that came out a year or two ago? And you notice how they would get up in Congress and call each other names. So perennialist was one of the names that people used to call each other. Wife beater, perennialist. But really what it means is this belief that there is a consistent truth that is revealed in different ways through different traditions over time. And that what that truth does, it reflects what that actual divine ultimate is. Like you said, well, I got a sense there's something in common, but it's kind of hard to put the words on it. This is saying, okay, yeah, there is that, and we can put words on it. We can say exactly what it is.
But then it also says they were Christian, they just didn't know it yet.
Exactly.
Because Christ is the eternal truth, whether
Yes. Yeah.
he came, whether it was before he actually arrived or after he arrived. The truth is
Right.
eternal. The Christian truth is eternal.
Because
right?
Muhammad was just a guy, whereas Christ was the Son of God.
Of course.
Except from a Muslim point of view, of course, Jesus was a prophet and Moses was a prophet. And they had revelations that were relevant for their time, and then Muhammad came and gave the revelation that superseded them, because it built on them, but it brought the revelation forward. So, depending on where you stand, of course, and that's where it gets tricky.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
what's the ultimate truth? How do you decide out of those different standpoints which one is the right one? And that's perennialism is essentially saying that there is a right way. There is a right way. There is a way that actually reflects the transcendent, that actually reflects that hidden dimension that is behind the world. So okay, so you have this 4th, 5th century idea. You get into Islamic thought. We talked about Ibn Rushd in the 12th century, who tried to revive rational philosophy. And his argument was that essentially philosophy is an equal path to God. Religion is a path to God, but philosophy is an equal path to God. So, and we talked also in the first week about how Ibn Rushd in Europe was called Averroes, and the Averroists really liked this idea, were the people who liked this idea that philosophy could provide an alternate path to God. Why? Because the church had the monopoly on authority and truth. But if philosophy provided an alternate path to truth, then all of a sudden the church no longer held sole authority. This was a workaround. you could get where you wanted to go without submitting to the church, without being subject to the church's authority.
And philosophy actually represented reason.
Yes.
So it was reason in philosophy, which was
Rational.
rational reason, which was a very specifically powerful lobby in Islam at that time.
Actually was fading by that time, but
Well, it was fading, but what it did through Rushd was actually permeate into European
Europe,
thought, which
exactly.
eventually created the Restoration.
the Reformation,
I mean, the Renaissance.
Renaissance.
No, actually the Reformation, the Renaissance, but the Reformation.
The Reformation also,
Right.
yes. Right.
Because
that was a reason.
rationalism permeated Europe through the rationalism of Islam,
Right.
and Islam actually had their era of rationalism, and then started moving more toward the mystical. But the rationalism moved north into Europe. So as Islam was turning toward the mystical, the Europeans were moving toward the rational.
And there's a
Very
real
interesting.
there's a real resonance between the Reformation and Ibn Rushd's teaching, because Ibn
Right,
Rushd was
that's what I'm
saying
saying.
there is another path. You can discover truth for yourself.
Right, exactly.
And the Reformation said there is another path. You can read the scriptures for yourself. You can apply your own mind to the scriptures and interpret them.
Right.
You don't have to subject yourself to the authority of the church.
So, last night I was checking on some things because Glenn and I were talking about this, and I knew that Rushd was contemporary with a lot of the Sufi masters that we have, known by reading poetry and such. Arabi, for instance. Rumi. And the discussion was, and I just scanned over it last night, was that Rushd had a very difficult time with Sufism because he was such a rationalist, right. Philosophically based seeker. That was his lens, and he saw Sufism as, sort of a blown out, irrational system. It was like, well, give me your philosophical treatise here. I want to hear some reason behind this devotional stuff that you do. So that was his, his discomfort with this. And then, of course,
Right.
his people used it in the same way with the Catholic Church.
The people the Europeans who were attracted to his teachings
Right.
started challenging the authority of the church. This didn't go over real well in Rome, and it was a real crisis, because had Averroism spread unchecked, it would have very possibly brought down the church.
Which it finally did.
And
Not completely, but
in a sense, I mean, certainly the church has nothing like the influence it used to have in Western culture.
right.
But the hero of the Catholic Church who saved the day was Thomas Aquinas. And he did so by one very small, clever shift of the paradigm, which was, yes, philosophy is an alternate path to truth, but it is only a partial path. Christianity gives you the full path, it gets you all the way there. Philosophy, there is some light in philosophy, but not enough to save you. Very small twist, but it made the difference. And this is the historical basis for the perennialist view that there is some light in all other traditions, just not enough to save you. See that little maneuver there?
Loopholes, loopholes, and loopholes. The old loopholes.
Yes, there's validity in that. It's not enough. There's still only one path. So that's kind of the Christian version of perennialism. In the 16th century, you had a theologian by the name of Agostino Stucco, who wrote the first treatise called The Perennial Philosophy. And in that, he wrote one principle of all things, of which there has always been one and the same knowledge among all peoples. So there you have it. That's the essence of perennial philosophy. So it's not a new idea, but it was revived in the 20th century. Aldous Huxley wrote a book called Perennial Philosophy in the 50s. Fridtjof Schumann also advanced this idea, as well as Guénon, as well as the Theosophists, Theosophical school. So this idea that, yes, they all look different here. So below that line on that graph, you have the various traditions. That's the part you see in the manifest world. But behind the manifest world, in the domain, in the dimension that is hidden, there is a single truth that all of those reflect imperfectly and partially. Of course, in the 20th century, the person who has given the most development to this 20th and 21st is Ken Wilber. Are either of you acquainted with Ken Wilber?
Just a little.
Okay.
Not much.
Okay. Well, he's written a number of books, popular author. And in the transpersonal movement, his ideas of perennial philosophy, or based on perennial philosophy, were the dominant paradigm from the time it was, from 1975 until about 2000, when he left to found what he calls integral psychology, which is a continuation of his ideas. So at the same time that he left, Jorge Ferrer, who I studied with, brought in participatory philosophy, which is what we're going to be talking about more next week, as a new paradigm, as a new way of looking at transformative work, and how spiritual traditions fit together. So one of the first insights that he had in his study of perennialism, in his critique of perennialism, was that it's not all the same thing. There's actually a number of different ways that people have explained perennialism. They have tried to explain how the traditions are all fitting together. You have what you call basic perennialism, which is sort of lumping everything together and saying, there's really only one path and one goal. An example of that is in the Romantic period, the Transcendentalists. Can either of you read that?
I lay down the book and go to my well for water, and lo, there I meet the servant of the Brahmin, priest of Brahma, and Vishnu and Indra, who still sits in the temple of the Ganges,
Oh, jeez.
reading the Vedas. I meet his servant, come to draw water for his master, and our buckets, as it were, grate together in the same well. The pure waldron water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges.
So here's Henry David Thoreau really sort of poetically conflating Hinduism and his own version of personal spirituality, without really kind of getting into the details. Because of course, if you're going Brahma and Vishnu, the next one would be Shiva, not Indra. But the point is that he's taking a poetic view. He is just blending these together and really suggesting that there's only one path and one goal. We're all really doing the same thing. That's basic perennialism. Then there's the esotericist version, which suggests that there are many different paths, but there's one goal. And if we look back at Schuon or Guénon or Huxley. That's the version that they were using. Then you have perspectivist perennialism, which is, yeah, there are many paths, but they actually arrive at different facets of the same goal. So in the 50s, well, actually in 1960, W.T. Stace wrote this book about two types of mystical experience, and what he said was that some people look out into the world and they see the one. What's more typical of mystics is to look inside, and at the bottom of the self they find the one. But that both are valid paths, and they both arrive at a similar, they both arrive at a different aspect of the same goal. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
One, you're going out into the external world, one, you're going into the internal world, but they're different aspects of the one.
But don't you think that when one goes inner to discover self, that's when one discovers resonances of self everywhere?
Sure.
I mean, aren't
could
they sort
certainly
of
argue
contingent
that.
on each other in a way?
Yeah. Another one is typological perennialism. So, for example, if you look at Indian religion, you have the Hindu religion, you have the practice of japa, which is counting the beads, praying, and doing a practice of a little ring with beads. If you go to Islam, you also have the very similar ring of beads, where you're saying the 99 names of Allah. If you go to Catholicism, you have the rosary. You're saying, you're using the very same prayer device to say to support you in the process of saying the prayers. So there you have a particular practice, a particular path that is essentially showing up in a variety of different traditions. And the final one is structuralist perennialism, which says there's one path and one God, one goal, but there are many cultural variations of that path. So that's different than saying there's many different paths and one goal. There's actually one path, but it shows up in different cultural garb. Okay? And that's the variety that Wilber uses. So what his version is to say that behind the visible world there is this non-dual dimension, and that is the source of the world and of the goal of each one of these spiritual traditions. They're all heading for the non-dual. And the non-dual is essentially that. It's like it has no dimension. There's no time, no space, no matter. It's just sort of that creative, that empty creative source that is constantly producing the world. Now, the reason that this hasn't caught on widely is because in scholarly circles there's a very basic criticism of it, and that criticism is that perennial philosophy is metaphysical. So what does that mean to you, that something is metaphysical? What does that word mean to you? You think somebody says, oh, what's metaphysical? What would you say?
That it's not physical.
Mm-hmm.
Just not physical, as in, like it doesn't exist? Or?
Well, see, in the popular layman would be it's just this airy-fairy, it doesn't really exist. It's just a theoretical or
Imaginary.
a concept, imaginary. Yes.
So, but if you were taking it seriously, what would it represent?
Meta meaning more combined.
Beyond.
Beyond, yeah.
So beyond the physical. meaning that sort of hidden spiritual dimension.
Yes.
Okay. Actually, that's not what it means in this context. But that is very much the popular conception. I always thought so until I did some research on it. Like, oh, it's like, well, you go to a metaphysical bookstore to find out about things, you read about things that are beyond the physical dimension, right?
Yeah.
You want to look at those things that are kind of in the spiritual dimension. That's not the origin of the word in philosophy. The origin of the word in philosophy actually goes back to Aristotle. So in Europe, there was many of the Greek writings that they did not have, but they did have some pieces of Aristotle, and particularly after, of course, you have the translations coming in from the East. But in the library of the works of Aristotle that remain, there are 8 that have to do with the properties of the physical world. Now, in the medieval cataloging system, they put these together and said, oh, these books are called physics. And the student who's coming up is going to be given these books to read first, because they're considered simpler to grasp. They're philosophical treatises about the natural world. Now, after you've read physics, you get to read his other 14 books. So you read them after physics. So those are metaphysics. It's just the convention about the book, the topic area in Aristotle. And what is that topic? That topic is, what is the starting point of philosophy? We were talking before about how if you look from Christian point of view, well, all of the, perennialist Christian point of view, all of these traditions have the truth, but they were Christian, they just didn't know it. From a Muslim point of view, well, Moses and Jesus were important, they were valid, they were real prophets of God, and Muhammad is the latest, and he kind of updates it, so it kind of supersedes them, doesn't replace them, but supersedes them as in terms of bringing it current. So depending on where you stand, it totally changes how you see it, right? Because philosophy, or metaphysics, is about starting points. But where you start depends on the kind of world that you live in. The kind of world that you experience depends on where you start. It's kind of a chicken and egg. So if you start assuming that the world is made of particles, then guess what? You're going to be looking for an understanding of how the particles work. And that's what you're going to find. If you start with the assumption that the world is made of something else, then you're going to develop your system of inquiry in a different way, and you're going to end up with a different kind of knowledge. So how do you find out which one is real? Which one is the right one? What's the correct starting point?
I don't know, but that says that metaphysics is going to tell me.
That's right. Metaphysics.
And then after
Claims.
that, you're going to tell me.
Of course. The whole point of postmodernism is that there is no one starting point. There is no right starting point. But metaphysics says, oh, but there is. Because if you look in the manifest world, you can't find the correct starting point. But if you have the hidden teaching, if you have the secret knowledge of the invisible dimension out of which the world comes, then you will know how to properly read the world. Then you will know what the right starting point is. So in science, they're essentially saying, listen, we don't have metaphysical assumptions, we work based on evidence. And we do empirical work, and that's how we arrive at information. Metaphysical system is saying, oh, but you can't really understand the world unless you understand the hidden secret dimension out of which the world is formed, and that reflects how it really is. Get the tension there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so karma, for example, is a metaphysical construct because you can see that people have consequences in their lives, within their lives. But you can't see, there is no empirical evidence that if somebody encounters a disaster that is actually coming from something that they did in another life. There's no physical evidence for that. There's no way to do an empirical study. And go, oh, all right, let's see, okay, 1859, you were a pirate, and this person was your hostage, and you didn't treat them well, so now they're your boss, and they're not treating you well, and that's just payback. So you should just accept that as your karma, as you learning the lesson of what it's like, you getting the other side, right? There's no way you can come up with empirical evidence for that. So the only way you can believe it is by making an assumption about how the world really is, what the structure of the world really is in dimensions that you can't see. Then once you have that lens, you can put it over your daily experience or the experience of others and say, well, see, this is why this is happening. That's a metaphysical construct. Taking an idea based on a dimension that you can't see and using it as evidence to explain what you can see. So just as an example, have you heard of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster? You probably have. No?
No.
Oh, well, gosh, education is lacking.
That's why I'm here.
Is it the true right path?
It is.
Oh.
It is, yes. The followers are known as Pastafarians.
Well, I've always liked pasta, and now I know why.
Yeah.
Oh.
Now you know why. It's a tongue-in-cheek thing, and it was really developed by a guy who was protesting the idea that intelligent design was a scientific theory and that should be taught next to evolution. So what he was kind of making a point. So he came up with this whole letter that he wrote, and all this merchandising and everything, and it's very tongue-in-cheek. He's got if you want to send donations, please do so. Here's a picture of the sailboat that I want. So, and he wrote this very clever letter, and I don't know, Jeff, if you can read that highlighted paragraph.
I and many others around the world are of the strong belief that the universe was created by a flying spaghetti monster. It is he who created all that we see and all that we feel. We feel strongly that the overwhelming scientific evidence pointing towards evolutionary process is nothing but a coincidence put in place by him. Wait a minute, is that out of the Bible or is that?
That's out of the
Spaghetti monster.
yes, the spaghetti monster scripture. Somebody read that one? Or?
Sure. We tend to be very secretive, as many people claim our beliefs are not substantiated by observable evidence. What these people don't understand is that he built the world to make us think the earth is older than it really is. For example, a scientist may perform a carbon dating process on an artifact. He finds that approximately 75% of the carbon-14 has decayed by electron emission to nitrogen-14, and infers that his artifact is approximately 10,000 years old, as the half-life of carbon-14 appears to be 5,730 years. But what our scientist does not realize is that every time he makes a measurement, the flying spaghetti monster is there changing the results with his newly invented.
Right. So this is a perfect example of a metaphysical construct. There's this theory of something that you can't see that is the actual cause for what's happening in the world. And there's no way to argue with it. Because whatever you say, well, that's the flying spaghetti monster that wants it to be that way.
Well, the flying spaghetti monster created time, therefore we don't understand quite exactly what 10,000 years even is.
Exactly. So the
Right.
minute
It
you
sounds
Yes.
like a lot of, you know,
Mhm.
a lot of evangelical Christian concepts.
Uh-huh.
So
You know,
the-
so that it always loops back. You know,
Yeah.
it's a circular kind of.
Mhm.
the minute you have an invisible cause that explains things, then you can explain almost anything. That's metaphysical. So, and that's the criticism that is being leveled at perennial philosophy, right? So it's the idea that looking at the world through the lens of this hidden dimension is the same as empirical evidence. Okay, let me say that again. That looking at the world through the lens of the hidden dimension is the same as empirical evidence. So, for example, looking at the carbon-14 result and saying, oh, well, you see, it came out this way, but see, that just shows that the flying spaghetti monster is changing the results. Or he has another example. He's got a chart where he says, you know, that what the flying spaghetti monster demands is that his followers wear pirate regalia, they dress up as pirates. And that the real reason for global warming is that the number of pirates in the world has been declining. And so he shows that as global warming has risen, the number of pirates has decreased. So therefore, there you have empirical evidence.
Yes.
See? Now, of course, global warming has increased, and the number, well, except for now the Somalis, I don't know if that's still true, but certainly into the beginning, through the end of the 20th century, the number of pirates was gradually decreasing, or 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, right? So you can say that those two facts correlate. But to say that that is evidence that the flying spaghetti monster is real is to look through the lens of this metaphysical construct. And that's what makes it not evidence. Okay? So, metaphysics isn't just the belief about things that are invisible, such as, you know, God or angels, but the belief that a hidden dimension is what explains the way the world is. The world is this way because of the influence of a hidden dimension. You can't understand how the world is until you have the secret knowledge. Then you can explain the world correctly. So there was this event that happened just last week. There was a train track over in the East Bay, and it was going through this rural area, and there was this mother hen and these little chicks, and the mother hen was crossing the track, and the little chicks were following behind her, and just as she got to the middle of the tracks, she heard a train coming. And so she clucked and called all of her chicks to her, and they huddled under her wings, and she crouched down, and the train came and roared across. And after the train had passed, she stood up, and all the little chicks came out, and they continued across the railroad track. And here's the evidence. Here's a picture of the railroad track with the hen and the chicks. See, there's empirical evidence that the story is true. Can't you see that? So the mistake is to take empirical evidence, to take something that you can see and take it as evidence that explains something that you can't. That's the problem. So
Isn't that called a miracle?
That makes sense. If you put water in a bowl, it's flat. If you look at water in a lake, it's flat. Therefore, the ocean is flat and the world is flat.
of course,
That's right.
and any small deviation from flatness couldn't possibly account for something different.
No, that ship going down and up, it's
Just because it's far away.
Yes, yes. You just can't see the ship, but it's still flat.
Or if I see Christ in my rye toast, my morning breakfast, piece of toast, and there's a clear picture of Jesus Christ, that my toast made,
Mm-hmm.
then that verifies the fact that he is truly the Messiah and is real.
Yes, and I just can't see it because I'm actually Muslim. But I just haven't seen it yet.
That's right.
Yeah.
Your eyes have not been opened. Yes.
So what does this say?
Oh.
What is this thing?
What does this say?
Let's see, metaphysics and the hidden.
No.
pattern.
What's the hidden pattern there? What does it say?
What is it?
What do the words say in that square?
Nothing. I always failed at these.
You're not a code breaker, are
I always said there's something wrong with me. Everybody else can see things in these things, and I can't.
It looks the letters actually look like Hebrew letters to me.
No, they're English letters.
They're English letters.
Pretty.
Pretty. Okay. What else?
I see. It's like one word.
Mm-hmm.
In.
Pink.
There you go.
Pretty and pink.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
$50,000.
Now you can do that.
Yes.
You've just changed
Well,
your
what I was
belief
gonna say,
system.
I was gonna say earlier was please.
Give me the answer, please. The
She's
answer
the
to the
prophetess.
world. You're the prophet now.
That's right.
The pink religion.
There we go. I'm gonna go home and write my own
Treat-
vision and mission.
Yes. You already know who's going to write your theme song. Pink. Okay. And your first answer was also correct because it doesn't really say anything. There aren't actually any letters there.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's funny.
If you take it for what it is, there are no letters there.
Right.
It's only if you know that this was designed to conceal a message.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
If you believe that it was designed to conceal a message, then you can read a message there,
Mhm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also a phrase we've heard.
Yes, right.
Mm-hmm.
So what about this? How many triangles do you see?
Oh my goodness.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Two big ones. You could say 8 small ones, including the 2 big ones.
Okay. Now the truth is there are no triangles there.
Right.
There are no triangles
Yeah.
there.
Uh-huh.
It's only if we take what seems to be implied,
Yes.
Very true.
Yeah.
but there are no triangles there.
Mhm.
That's very true.
So that's the difference between looking for the hidden pattern and looking at what's actually there.
Oh yeah, you're getting into that old Gestalt character.
No, not really. I'm just using it as an illustration
Exactly.
of how perennial philosophy works
Mm-hmm.
and why it's metaphysical. Okay.
But we also, yeah, it's just what we agree on, isn't it, too? Right? In a way, we're
it's-
agreeing that there's triangles there.
We're used to seeing triangles. We're used to seeing, so we see that and we expect them to be there. So we read in
Right.
something that
Right.
isn't there.
Yes.
We're familiar with
Yeah.
the kinds of shapes that people draw, and we see things that seem
Right.
to imply that, and we assume that they're there. And we actually see them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when we come to all these different spiritual traditions with a perennialist lens, then we see in the diversity the unity that we assume to be behind them in the hidden dimension.
So we track what's resonant rather than what's not resonant.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
You ever been in a relationship with somebody you thought, oh God, we are so alike?
Yeah, boy.
After a few years, it's like, how could I possibly have thought that?
No, I also know that whenever I bought a new car, everybody else buys one too.
Yeah,
Same
all of a
one.
sudden you see it everywhere on the road, right?
Right? So, the reason that the unity is seen in these different paths is because you're looking through a lens that assumes that the unity is there, that there is a hidden dimension behind the world that is showing up through them, and then you see the evidence in them. And if you can't distinguish between the evidence that you see because you're looking through a lens and what's actually there, then you're stuck in a metaphysical belief. So, that puts us back to this problem. How do we extract what's common without transformational work, without either making all traditions wrong, or right but not real, or just one of them right? And so, you know, the challenge here is that once you say that you have the same hidden dimension behind all of these traditions, and then you put details on it, you say, well, this is what that hidden dimension is like, then what you create is a ranking system among different traditions, because they really are different. And in Wilber's version of the perennialist model, which takes the non-dual as ultimate, then he ranks the different traditions. He says, well, you know, Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, they actually go all the way to the non-dual. But, you know, Christianity or indigenous religions or Judaism, they still have some separation between the self and the divine. Therefore, they're lesser. They're inferior paths. Recognize this kind of graph from anywhere else?
But the graph is wrong, because Christianity goes all the way to the top.
It's just another version of that model that says Christianity has all truth, and the other ones have some truth, but they're lesser. The thing is, because there is so much diversity in the traditions, the minute you name what the ultimate is, as long as you kind of have the vague sense that they're similar, then you can say that they're probably all equally valid. But the minute you define what the ultimate is, you're going to get a ranking system.
And you know, another point that you're probably going to make, but I'm just going to bring it up now. But the other thing is that one does not really know a tradition unless one is practicing it. So
Right.
anyone who's
Right.
sitting on the outside of the tradition is
Right.
only seeing it through their lens, which is of course
Yeah.
limiting their relationship and their understanding of the tradition, of the other traditions. There's no way that someone outside of a tradition who's not practicing that particular ritualized tradition can really get it from the
Well,
outside.
Here's actually how it works with the, the people who follow Wilber's model. And that is, if somebody within a tradition were to raise that objection, they would say, oh, but you have such a limited lens on it because you're only looking from within your tradition. I'm looking from an integral point of view, and I'm looking through this lens, and I can see the truth in all of them. Therefore, my perspective is actually superior to yours. And you, living in this tradition, we shouldn't listen to you, we should listen to me, because my perspective is the more powerful one.
Mhm.
You don't actually understand fully what you're doing because you're only locked within one tradition. I have a broader view, my interpretation. You don't yet have the integral lens. So, which is another example of the fact that not only is there a problem with this kind of system being metaphysical, there's also a problem with it being hierarchical. It imposes a hierarchy. It allows for diversity, but imposes a hierarchy on them.
Well, the minute that you allow for the diversity, but it has to be under one unified view, then there is not diversity, right?
Right.
There is
Yes.
not diversity.
It keeps circling back around.
That's
Oh.
right. And the other issue is that there are some cases there is actually factual evidence that contradicts the assumption that everybody has the same goal. So, for example, one of my colleagues, Elias Capriles, has been practicing Dzogchen Buddhism, one of the higher vehicles of Buddhism, for more than 30 years, and so he's very well, he teaches Eastern religions at the University of the Andes in Venezuela, and has pointed out that if you look at Hinduism, of course Hinduism is not a singular thing. There's many different paths within Hinduism, but sort of, it got the name Hinduism because the British came along and looked at all of these hugely diverse, deity traditions and spiritual practices in this area and said, well, they're all in the Hindu valley here, so we'll call them, this is the Hindu religion. But generally speaking, to the degree that you can speak generally, the highest state that you achieve in Hinduism is samadhi. Now samadhi, when you go into samadhi, you lose contact with the physical senses. The awareness turns back on itself. And there is reportedly the experience of bliss, but you don't have any contact with the physical world. You're in a state that is isolated from any awareness of the physical world. So that's the highest state, more or less speaking, in what more or less could be called Hinduism, even though there's a variety of different major schools within Hinduism, and all kinds of diversity. Right? Within Buddhism, the highest state is Buddhism is more consistent than Hinduism. It has a lot less diversity, but it still has plenty of diversity. The highest state is, without question, nirvana. In the state of nirvana, you're still aware of the physical world. All of your senses are operating. You even have thoughts that operate. But your relationship to your sense experience and to your thoughts is different. So, to say that the goal is the same in a tradition where the highest state is complete escape from physical experience, as one where it is a different relationship with full physical experience, is a little hard to explain. if the ultimate goal of these two paths is actually the same thing, how come it's not the same thing? How come it is sort of about as opposite as you could get?
The question that comes up for me is here we're talking about state. We're not talking about divine presence. All of the states are ostensibly the location that one can be in to experience divine presence at its best, right?
Well, in samadhi, one is one with the divine presence. In nirvana, in Buddhism, deities are at a lower level, and you kind of pass through that level, and you finally arrive at the awareness of how the world actually is, which is actually beyond deities, which is it's beyond any concept of divine. It is simply being with the world exactly as it is, with the co-arising phenomena in the present moment.
But does that point to a divergent idea of the actual divine, rather than two different experiences of the divine, interpreted by two different cultural experiences or metaphysical experiences? Do you know what I'm saying? If you're talking about the actual...
It's as different as saying, well, somebody who's awake and somebody who's asleep, they're really doing the same thing. So, I mean, and trying to find up a way to explain that they're actually doing the same thing.
Right. So what I'm saying is, we pointed toward this, not that they're doing the same thing, they're obviously doing something different, but the source that they're trying to reach through those states, are we pointed there as something that is not necessarily resonant? That there's that, because that's what the charts show. The charts show that all of these different traditions are going toward the actual. Well, that's the thing. Is there such a thing as an objective divine presence?
Exactly.
That's the whole point that we're heading toward here. That I'm just bringing myself to, because if there's an objective divine presence, everyone's trying to get there through from their own traditions and states. But is there such a thing as an objective divine presence?
Right. Can you study presence as an object?
Right.
Or are you always in relationship with it to have any experience of it? And if you're in relationship with it, is what you experience a product of relationship rather than of something that is objective and separate from you?
Well, that's the ultimate question, right? Because my interpretation of this would be that, in Hinduism, that is what they have set the precedent for as being the highest state you can get to. That has been their work through their experience and their structure to that point. The same with Buddhism, That is just their experience and their relationship to it.
Right. But it makes it harder to say that there is an objective experience. There's this experience of something objective, and that thing that is objective is the same.
Yeah.
So, if perennial philosophy doesn't work, what will? And what we're going to look at next time is a participatory approach, which says that there are many paths and many goals. Instead of all rivers run to the sea, it's an ocean with many shores. We all share the same world, but we don't all have the same location in the world. Because of our location, we are on different paths, and we will arrive at different goals, because it's a big world. Doesn't mean we can't find resonances, doesn't mean we can't have dialogue, doesn't mean we can't learn. In fact, it means we can learn. Because if we're not actually doing the same thing, if we're not assuming that everybody else is actually really like us, then we can learn from them. And we can step back from our assumptions that we know who they are, and actually see what's going on for them. Maybe learn from that.
That's a great symbolism there, that there's many goals, different colors, but then the colors are all made up of light, so then that becomes, in a sense, the same goal, but then they're different goals, and it
Of course,
just
they're all
keeps
circles.
looping around.
They're all circles.
Oh, they're exactly the same goal. Oh. I just didn't see it. I was looking through the wrong
Now you
lens.
know the hidden pattern.
Yeah, yes.
And one of the key points there that we'll be coming back and spending some time with is location. That we share the same world, but we don't share the same location. Because of that, our relationships will be different. And where we end up will be different. And that fits with that. That's a way to take at face value what the evidence actually is, without trying to force it through some lens. See, the perennialist lens, it's like once you see that you have 5 different kinds of perennialism, that should raise an alarm bell. Because it's like, oh, well, that means that you have to interpret the evidence in a very, very specific way. It's kind of like the story of the woman who calls the police and says, "There's a naked man outside my window." And, okay, are you sure? "Yes, there's a naked man. I can see a naked man through my window." Oh, okay, so they send an officer out, and the officer comes in, looks out the window, says, "I don't see one." She said, no, here, you pull the table over here, you put the chair up on it, and you go up, and you look from that corner up there, and see, you can see him, he's right there. So the thing is that with the perennialist model, you have to structure things very carefully in order to get them to fit. And there's disagreement about how to structure them. It isn't a self-evident thing. Some people say, "Oh, no, it's like this. Oh, no, it's like this. Oh, no, it's like that." So you have to position yourself just right, hold your mouth in a certain way, and then you can see that all the traditions are the same. But if you don't do that, it's not self-evident. If you just go and look at it and go, "Wow, no, that's really different. Oh, that's really different." And this is a way of acknowledging that. But you'll see that it's a way of acknowledging without erasing the differences, but also without making it just social stories. A way of connecting and saying there's actual things happening in the world. So that's where we're going.